1. The Kantian turn. 1.1 The Copernican turn. When Kant called his new project in Critique of Pure Reason the Copernican turn, he was alluding to his own inversion of the subject-object hierarchy, while pre-Kantian metaphysics had maintained that the subject copies the external object. Kant proposed that objects are constituted by the form that the subject projects into the external world. In this sense, the Kantian turn is obviously a shift toward subject-centrism, or anthropocentrism, while the turn known by the name of Copernicus tends toward the opposite, the shift from geocentrism to heliocentrism, a negation of the stance that is earth-centered, identifiable as ego-centered. Did Kant ignore the turn in the latter sense? No, I think not. It is my contention that in his constellation of thoughts surrounding the thing in itself, and/or transcendental object, he was echoing this very essence of the Copernican turn, especially in stressing the passivity of subject in relation with the external, objective world. Kant wrote in Critique of Pure Reason, the sensible faculty of intuition is really only a receptivity for being affected in a certain way with representations, whose relation to one another is a pure intuition of space and time, pure forms of our sensibility, which, insofar as they are connected and determinable in these relations, in space and time, according to laws of the unity of experience, are called object. The non-sensible cause of these representations is entirely unknown to us, and therefore we cannot intuit it as an object. For such an object would have to be represented neither in space nor in time, as mere conditions of our sensible representation, without which conditions we cannot think any intuition. Meanwhile we can call the merely intelligible cause of appearances in general the transcendental object, merely so that we may have something corresponding to sensibility as a receptivity. To this transcendental object we can ascribe the whole extent and connection of our possible perceptions, and say that it is given in itself prior to all experience. But appearances are, in accordance with it, given not in themselves but only in this experience, because they are merely representations, which signify a real object only as perceptions, namely when this perception connects up with all others in accordance with the rules of the unity of experience. 1. The central concern in this passage is the thing, which, prior to our act of constituting objects, affects the subject by means of sensibility and provides it with its contents, what appears to be the world. In other words, Kant stresses the passivity or Geworfenheit, thrownness, of the subject. All philosophers after Kant except for Heidegger, even such a faithful Kantian as Schopenhauer, denied the exterior validity of the concept of the thing in itself. As a consequence, Kant came to be mistakenly identified as the founder of the philosophy of subjectivity, that which insists upon the subject as actively constituting the world. This interpretation certainly seems to accord with Kant's implication in regard to the Copernican turn, but Kant himself was quick to deny the simple-minded idealism. If so, what did Kant really seek to do? Did he simply intend to combine rationalism and empiricism critically? In order to grasp the Kantian Copernican turn precisely, one first has to clarify the turn of Copernicus himself. The idea of heliocentrism had existed since ancient times, so it was not his invention. But it was prohibited, and Copernicus was rather hesitant to endorse this new cosmological position during his lifetime. According to Thomas Kuhn, Copernicus basically followed the Ptolemaic cosmology even into Revolutionibus, which was published in 1543, the year he died. It was only the addendum to the book, the part that only astronomers could decipher, that became influential for the coming age. His real contribution here was the proposition that the discrepancy among the revolutions of heavenly bodies, which had dogged geocentrism since Ptolemy, could be solved if and only if we would see the globe as revolving around the sun. This hypothesis does not offer positive proof of heliocentrism itself, however, and it took as long as a century for it to be fully accepted as a cosmological principle. Nonetheless, even those who still believed in geocentrism had to rely on the Copernican system of calculation. Although they believed that the truth was that the sun revolves around the earth, for the sake of calculation they still could think as if the opposite were the case. After all, the true significance of the Copernican turn lay in the hypothetical stance itself. In other words, The significance lay not in forcing any choice between geocentrism or heliocentrism, but rather in grasping the solar system as a relational structure, using terms such as Earth and Sun, that is totally independent of empirically observed objects or events, and only this stance could render the turn toward heliocentrism. Thus the significance of the Copernican turn was twofold. In the same manner Kant managed to get around the basic contradiction in the philosophy of his time, whether it was founded in the empirical senses, as was empiricism, or in rational thinking, as was rationalism. Instead, Kant introduced those structures, that is, forms of sensibility or categories of understanding, of which one is unaware, calling them transcendental structures. Words such as sensibility, Sinnlichkeit and understanding, Verstand had long existed as conceptualizations of life experience, to sense and to understand. But Kant completely altered their meanings in a way similar to what Copernicus had done when he rediscovered Sun and Earth as terms within the solar system qua reciprocal structure. But here it is not necessary to reiterate Kant's terminology. What is crucial is this architectonic that is called transcendental. And even if these particular words or concepts are not always used in various post-Kantian contexts, the same architectonic can be found there. One notable example is psychoanalysis, in which Thomas Kuhn saw a direct correspondence with the Copernican turn. Because the Copernican theory is in many respects a typical scientific theory, its history can illustrate some of the processes by which scientific concepts evolve and replace their predecessors. In its extrascientific consequences, however, the Copernican theory is not typical. Few scientific theories have played so large a role in non-scientific thought. But neither is it unique. In the 19th century, Darwin's theory of evolution raised similar extrascientific questions. In our own century, Einstein's relativity theories and Freud's psychoanalytic theories provide centers for controversies from which may emerge further radical reorientations of Western thought. Freud himself emphasized the parallel effects of Copernican discovery that the Earth was merely a planet and his own discovery that the unconscious controlled much of human behavior too. For that matter, the revolutionary aspect of Freudian psychoanalysis was not in the idea of the unconscious controlling much of human behavior, as presented as early as in interpretation of dreams, and this idea had existed since antiquity. It was in his attempt to see what exists in the gap between consciousness and unconscious vis-à-vis the form of language. In the course of this attempt, he came to extract the unconscious qua transcendental structure. While stressing the wide impact of the Copernican turn beyond the domain of the natural sciences, Kuhn ignored Kant's own use of the figure. For Kuhn, too, was bound by the stereotype about Kant, namely, that the Kantian form and category were based on Euclidean geometry and Newtonian physics. Yet this is simply not true. As I will show later, Kant was able to conceptualize form with respect to sensibility only because he had already had a sense of the possibility of a non-Euclidean geometry. All in all, the crux of Kant's account of science was that scientific cognition is an open system, and that any scientific truth can be no more than a hypothesis, qua phenomenon. But those who identify or criticize Descartes and Kant as subjectivists, automatically posit geocentrism in Kant. Only as long as we are bound by the stereotype does it appear that Kant was an anthropocentrist, or rationalist, and that, in contrast, Freud posited the unconscious, like the sun, as the center by overturning the position that was consciousness-centered, earth-centered. But Kuhn's own position cannot even distinguish Freud from Jung. In fact, for him they are one and the same. While collaborating in his early career with Freud, Jung himself likened the concept of the Oedipus complex to the stable point outside of our own sphere on which an objective understanding of its currents becomes possible, comparable to the Copernican revolution. The importance of this realization should not be underestimated, for it teaches us that there is an identity of fundamental human conflicts which is independent of time and place. What aroused a feeling of horror in the Greeks still remains true, but it is true for us only if we give up the vain illusion that we are different, that is, morally better, than the ancients. We have merely succeeded in forgetting that an indissoluble link binds us to the men of antiquity. This truth opens the way to an understanding of the classical spirit such as has never existed before, the way of inner sympathy on the one hand and of intellectual comprehension on the other. By making the detour through the buried substructure of our own souls, we can seize for ourselves the vital meaning of the culture of antiquity, and by this means thus gain that stable point outside of our own sphere on which an objective understanding of its currents becomes possible. That at least is the hope we draw from the rediscovery of the immortality of the Oedipus problem 3. This manner of emphasizing the unconscious, or, more precisely, the collective unconscious, had already become influential in Romanticism, long before Freud and Jung. It was thus not Freud's property. In fact, Jung quoted from various Romantic poets and thinkers to support his claim. On the other hand, Freud opposed the general notion of collective unconscious. Freud's unconscious is strictly that which is discovered, or produced, in an analysand's resistance during the psychoanalytic dialogue. For Freud, there would be no unconscious if not for resistance, Widerstand and disavowal, Verleugnung. He conceptualized the triadic structure of ego, superego, and id, not as something that exists in empirical reality, but rather as a structural mechanism that is methodologically assumed to exist in resistance and disavowal. As Freud's figures of the judge of the superego and the censor of the superego clearly express, the triad is structurally similar to a court of law. And, for that matter, Kant too, persisted in speaking in judicial terms. Jung came to break away from Freud in a way very similar to that in which Herder, Fichte, and Schelling broke away from Kant. Alternatively put, Jung belonged to a lineage of Romanticism epitomized by the same philosophers. Jung's negation of rationalism certainly constituted a remarkable revolution, and it is true that, by contrast, Freud was faithful to the tradition of the Enlightenment insofar as he retained a rationalistic stance. But it was Freud who finally rendered the truly radical turn, one that is totally irrelevant to the concerns of vulgar Romanticism. Freudian psychoanalysis is as distinct from empirical psychology as it is from the collective unconscious. It is, as he claimed, a metapsychology and, in our context, a transcendental psychology. Seen from this perspective, the isomorphism between the Kantian faculties, of sensibility and understanding, and the Freudian psychical structure is evident. Both are discoveries of the transcendental query. That is, as a certain function that can be spoken of only as figure. They are functions about which we can only say that they are at work. And with Lacan, who sought to recover the Freudian sense of transcendental psychology, the triadic structure came to be even more ostensibly Kantian, Kantian illusion Lacanian imaginary. The form the symbolic, and the thing in itself the real. But my objective is not to interpret Kant through Freud, but the opposite. Kant is consistently the target of criticism accusing him to be the primogenitor of the philosophy of subjectivity. What Kant really did, however, was to present the boundaries or limits of human subjective faculties, and in so doing criticize metaphysics as an arrogation that oversteps those boundaries. Much like Freud's id, ego, and superego, Kant's sensibility, understanding, and reason are not things that exist empirically. In this sense, indeed, they are nothing. Which, however, is a nothing that exists as a certain function. More precisely, transcendental apperception, or subjectivity, is the function as nothing that bundles the three faculties together into a single system. Transcendental inquiry can be deemed ontological, Heidegger, in the sense that it discovers the function as nothing, qua being. At the same time, in the specific sense that it designs the structure of which we are unaware, it is also properly structuralist. But this kind of association does not always create new thoughts. Perhaps something is always lost in the contextual association. So it is that we persist in the Kantian term, transcendental, except that in order to elucidate its dynamism and function further, Transcritique has to intervene. Kant's Copernican turn is not a turn toward the philosophy of subjectivity, but that toward the thing in itself by a detour of the scrutiny of subjectivity. It was for this objective and nothing else that Kant elaborated the transcendental structure of subjectivity. Then, what is the concept thing in itself? it has always been concerned with the problematic of ethics, even before Critique of Practical Reason took ethics up as subject matter. It is concerned, in other words, with the problematic of the other. Kant did not initiate his whole project with the matter of the other. And neither would I. But one of the most crucial points I would like to address in this book is that the Kantian turn is a revolution toward thought centered on the other, and this turn was more radical than any self-claimed epistemological turn has been since. 1.2 Literary criticism and the transcendental critique. Kant's three critiques targeted three domains consecutively: scientific thought, morality, and the arts, and biology. Kant scrutinized not only the peculiarity of each domain, but also their relationship to each other, but his followers totally forgot that these domains had not existed as such before Kant. They were the discoveries of Kant's criticism. The sun has existed consistently since before and after Copernicus. It unchangingly rises from the east and sets in the west. But after Copernicus, it came to be another thing. The term took its place within the system of calculation. So now, with respect to the same sun, one has different objects. In the same way, before and after Kant, the categorization of scientific thoughts, moralities, and the arts was totally altered. One should not read Kant's books, therefore, taking his categorizations for granted. One should read the Kantian critique that itself created the categorization. Critique of Judgment, 1790, the last of the three critiques, is said to have posed a solution to problems omitted from the previous two: Critique of Pure Reason, 1781-1787, and Critique of Practical Reason, 1788. That is, the third critique ostensibly bridged the gaps between cognition and morality and between nature and freedom by way of positing art as the mediator. The main subject of the third critique, the faculty of judgment, is isomorphic to the faculty of imagination power, Einbildungskraft, that mediates sensibility and understanding in cognition. In Kant's view, art does not begin from concept but realizes it latently. In other words, art is that which can intuitively, or sensually, realize what cognition and morality are supposed to realize. This notion of art offered an important basis for the philosophers of Romanticism and thereafter. They believed that art was the authentic knowledge from which both science and ethics derived. In art, the synthesis of all domains was always already achieved. Hegel posited philosophy as being higher than art, but only after he had aestheticized philosophy. Heidegger, too, considered art, or poetry, as primordial in his turn from being and time to time and being. It is evident that Kant posited a clear relationality between science, ethics, and art with his three critiques. But what is more important is that he ultimately presented the structure in which the three categories form a ring, and that the thematic ring corresponds to the triadic categorical structure on a different level: thing in itself, phenomenon, and transcendental illusion, every one of which is indispensable for attaining the structure. Or the Borromean knot, to adopt a Lacanian term, but it is misleading to think that in the third critique he resolved the impasse he had encountered in the previous two. It is not that the Kantian critique, the discovery of the triadic structure, was brought to a completion by Kant's account either of art or of the judgment of taste, in the third critique. Instead, it could be said, from the beginning, the Kantian critique had been derived from the problematic of the artistic experience. There have been a number of etymological inquiries into the origin of Kant's use of the term critique, all of which return eventually to ancient Greece. But the problem with etymological retrospection is that it tends to occlude origins of the recent past, the actual historical formation. I rather believe that the Kantian critique came most immediately from criticism in the literal sense, that is, commercial journalism, and arena, Kampfplatz, wherein the classical aesthetics ascribed to Aristotle are no longer relevant, and thus ongoing is the struggle with respect to the assessment of value. Kant confessed that the remembrance of David Hume, especially his A Treatise of Human Nature, 1739, was the very thing that many years ago first interrupted the dogmatic slumber he was enduring under the influence of Leibniz's Wolffian School. 5. Perhaps this is true, but Hume's influence was not the main source of Kant's critical position. As Hans Vaihinger pointed out in his Kommentar zu Kants Kritik der reinen Vernunft, 2 vols, 1881–1892, what must have really awakened Kant was the book by the Scottish critic, Henry Home, 1766–1782, titled Element of Criticism. 1763–1766. According to Vaihinger, the following remark by Kant indicates why he read Home's book with such excitement. Home has more correctly called aesthetics criticism, because it does not, like logic, furnish a priori rules. 6. This suggests that Kant's use of the term critique may indeed have derived from Home. Kant first used the term critique of reason in an announcement for the arrangement of the lectures in the winter semester 1765–1766. 7. In the text, the critique of reason, Die Kritik der Vernunft, is considered logic in the wide sense, in juxtaposition to the critique of taste, Die Kritik des Geschmacks, namely, aesthetics, as that which has a very close affinity of material cause. From this too, one can presume a nexus shared by Kant's critique, and Home's book with its eponymous criticism. With Home, Kant seized the moment to reconsider the possibility of an aesthetic judgment of taste and to investigate its basis. Home had sought a universality of the judgment of taste, a measure of beauty and ugliness, in principles immanent in human essence. He insisted on the a priori nature of human sensibility with respect to beauty and ugliness. At the same time, however, Home employed empirical and inductive methods of observing the general rules of taste, collecting and categorizing materials from all the domains related to art and literature from antiquity to the present. Confronting the necessity of critical judgment, he refused to take any particular principle for granted and charged himself with the task of questioning the foundational principles or infallible measures of criticism. By taking up Home's term criticism, Kant further developed the concept into his own critique, a signifier of the fundamental scrutiny of rational human faculties. 8. Home had to confront the element of criticism particularly in England, because that is where two principles were clashing. On the one hand, there was classicism positing a certain empirical norm in art and literature. And on the other, there was the romanticist ideal cherishing an individual's uninhibited expression of emotion. Basically taking the latter standpoint, Home still dared to seek a ground where critical judgment could be universal, and Kant was especially struck by this endeavor. In Critique of Judgment, he dealt tacitly with the same thesis and antithesis. Like Home, Kant acknowledged that the judgment of taste had to be subjective, or individual, while believing at the same time that it should also somehow be universal. In Kant's case, however, he distinguished universality from generality. Thus we will say that someone has taste if he knows how to entertain his guests, at a party with agreeable things, that they can enjoy by all the senses, in such a way that everyone likes the party. But here it is understood that the universality is only comparative, so that the rules are only general, as all empirical rules are, not universal, as are the rules that a judgment about the beautiful takes upon itself, sich unternimmt or lays claim to. 9. A general rule induced from experience cannot be universal. Since Aristotle, aesthetics has been general and not universal, in the same way as physics. Classicism had consistently attempted to extrapolate rules from works that had been given the designation masterpieces, and make these rules normative. As opposed to this, for Kant, there could be no rule by which someone could be compelled to acknowledge that something is beautiful. 10. Nonetheless, the judgment of taste, which is distinguished from mere comfortableness, must be universal. The judgment of taste itself does not postulate everyone's agreement, since only a logically universal judgment can do that, because it can adduce reasons. It merely requires this agreement from everyone, es sind nur determined dies Einstimmung an, as an instance of the rule, an instance regarding which it expects confirmation not from concepts but from the agreement of others. Hence the universal voice is only an idea. 11. To make it doubly clear, postularen means to assume as self-evident, while ansinnen means to make an unreasonable request or demand. In the judgment of taste, there is no rule that can compel. At this juncture, Kant introduces common sense, sensus communis, that is, socially and historically engendered customs. In the new science, Giambattista Vico had argued that common sense, senso comune, is judgment without reflection, shared by an entire class, an entire people, an entire nation, or the entire human race. 12. Common sense is a norm, following which innumerable mediocre works are written. Common sense changes over time. But the change is not continuous because it is caused by the violent intervention of individuals, that is, geniuses, who oppose and deviate from it. For his part, however, Kant restricted this phenomenon to the judgment of taste only, that is, to the fine arts, die Schönen Kunst in scientific matters. Therefore, the greatest discoverer differs from the most arduous imitator and apprentice only in degree, whereas he differs in kind from someone whom nature has endowed for fine art. 13. But there is still a problem. If common sense is a historically transforming social convention, it cannot guarantee the universality of the judgment of taste. Common sense is both historically and presently plural, common senses. If there is universality at all, it must be beyond plural common senses. Did Kant give up, then, on the requirement of universality? Did he mean that in the fine arts one should make do with common senses, since universality may be found in other domains? Of course, such questions are themselves wrong. Kant certainly distinguished among natural science, ethics, and art, but the distinction itself is not his terminus ad cum, for he consistently required universality in each of these domains, in Critique of Pure Reason and Critique of Practical Reason. For example, he sought universal law as opposed to a general rule based upon experience. But, does it mean that scientific thought and ethics contain universal law while art lacks it? No. If universality is unaccounted for in art, it is the same in other domains. Or, at least, Kant began his thinking in this manner. The radicalism of his critique exists in that he reconsidered the question of universality from the vantage of the judgment of taste. In Critique of Pure Reason, Kant detects subjectivity in the autonomous act of understanding, while in Critique of Judgment, he uses the terms subjective versus objective in a highly prosaic manner. In other words, the sensuous in general is considered subjective. It follows that the multitude of individual subjects expresses themselves on the level of feeling, either pleasure or displeasure. Subjectivity as understanding, on the other hand, is considered an impersonal, a priori faculty, in this case, language's faculty, and does not appear as individual subject. Nonetheless, even though Kant poses the issue of plural subjectivity, beginning from the feeling of pleasure/displeasure, the problematic in Critique of Judgment is by no means confined to the matter of commonly understood cultural taste. In the arena of the judgment of taste, no one can prove the universality of his or her individual standpoint. And, viewed in inverse logic, when people cannot prove the truth of their cognition, they use the figure judgment of taste, no matter how serious the object. We say, well, it's just a matter of taste, or even, well, it's all a matter of taste. Indeed, every judgment ultimately results in a judgment of taste, except analytic judgment. Finally, Kant distinguishes the judgment of taste from the matter of pleasure, displeasure, or comfort. Comfort is acknowledged to be an individual matter, while the judgment of taste, from the beginning, is required to prove its universality. In other words, the judgment must be accepted by others. As Wittgenstein might say, comfort is a private language, while the judgment of taste belongs to a common language game. 14. When Kant speaks of common sense, this is it. And the real problem lies in the fact that there are many language games in the world. Therefore, the universality of the judgment of taste becomes a problem of communication among people who have different systems of rules, namely, among others. The requirement of universality in the judgment of taste is the sine qua non underlying all synthetic judgments. Therefore, it is wrong to think that Kant discovered an autonomous, peculiar problem in the fine arts. Rather, he sought to reconsider all problematics through criticism in the judgment of taste. Kant held that beauty is discovered by disinterest in the object. This is, as it were, a methodological bracketing of the interests. What kind of interests, then, must be bracketed? intellectual and moral. Confronting a certain object, one judges it in at least three domains simultaneously: true or false, good or bad, pleasurable or displeasurable. Usually these form an intermixed complexity. And only when a certain object is received by bracketing the other concerns, that is, true or false and good or bad, does it become an aesthetic object. But what Kant characterized with respect to the judgment of taste is applicable also to both cognition and morality. In modern science, the cognition of the object is realized only by bracketing judgments that are moral, good or bad, and aesthetic, pleasurable or displeasurable. In the same way, Kant attempts a purification with respect to morality. In this case, it is achieved by bracketing pleasure as well as happiness. It is crucial to keep in mind, however, that bracketing is not the same as negation. If this is the case, it is not outrageous that Kant solved the third antinomy in Critique of Pure Reason by considering that the conflicting terms could stand together. Thesis: causality in accordance with laws of nature is not the only one from which all the appearances of the world can be derived. It is also necessary to assume another causality through freedom in order to explain them. Antithesis: there is no freedom, but everything in the world happens solely in accordance with laws of nature. 15. The idea that everything is determined by natural cause is made possible by the position that brackets freedom. Conversely, only when the determination by natural cause is bracketed, can the idea of freedom intervene. Which idea is correct does not matter, for the very question never arises. One attains the cognitive domain by bracketing moral and aesthetic dimensions, but they must always be unbracketed whenever necessary. The same can be said of moral and aesthetic domains. When one seeks to explain everything from one and the same positionality, one is inexorably confronted by antinomy. I deal with the ethical question of freedom in section 3.4. Here I would stress one tangled problematic: cognitive, moral, and aesthetic domains are all constituted by a change of attitude, that is, transcendental reduction. And in the beginning these domains do not exist in and of themselves. It follows that in every domain the same problem recurs. For instance, in Critique of Practical Reason, the problem of the other is explicit. But it is implied in Critique of Pure Reason as well. And the very problem of the other is what Kant originally encountered with respect to aesthetic judgment. As I argue later, the thing in itself is ultimately equal to the other. But, in order to reach that point, it is a sine qua non to begin with the problematic of aesthetic judgment. What distinguishes the third critique from the first two is the appearance of plural subjectivities. To tackle this, Kant did not resort to, say, general consciousness or general subjectivity. Rather, he scrutinized what kind of agreement could be made among a multitude of subjectivities wherein there is no rule by which someone could be compelled to acknowledge that something is beautiful. Hannah Arendt granted primary importance to this aspect of the third critique and sought to read it as a principle of political science. 16. Jean-François Lyotard observed in it a mediation between language games without the establishment of a meta-language. 17. But Lyotard's reading is a regression to Hume, insofar as it considers the issue of universality to be simply one of the coalition among common senses. After all, it is misleading to presume a transition or development between Critique of Pure Reason and Critique of Judgment, since the former was already affected by and took into account the aporia posed in the arena of criticism in the journalistic sense. Thus our task is to reread Critique of Pure Reason from this vantage point. Kant's distinction between universality and generality sprang from the problematic of modern science, beginning with Copernicus. This should be distinguished from Francis Bacon's positions of corroborative evidence and induction exemplified. In the first place, the heliocentrism of Copernicus is not the kind of matter that is easily proven. Descartes sought to publish his account of the universe as one sympathetic to Copernicus, but abandoned his plan after learning about Galileo's prosecution, and then wrote Discourse on Method. As this anecdote might imply, Descartes was not necessarily speculative. Rather, he stressed the significance of hypothesis and presented a methodology where hypothesis comes first to be proven later by experimentation, by whomever, But, again, can hypothesis be verified by experimentation at all? It is impossible to induce a law from experience, or it is impossible to extract a universal proposition from singular propositions. A universal proposition is technically an indefinite expansion of conjunctive propositions wherein it is impossible to verify apodictically the infinite chain of elementary propositions. Thus the crux of Hume's skepticism is that since a universal proposition cannot be constituted, a law is finally no more than a custom. But some held that, while a universal proposition could not be verified positively, at least it could be proven false. And inasmuch as it is not proven false, the universal proposition can be considered true. Karl Popper famously maintained that the universality of the proposition could be claimed if no falsification were possible when a proposition is posed in a falsifiable way. Although Popper appreciated the fact that this idea was latent in Kant's own work, he also accused him of remaining in the subjectivist framework. 18 If a certain proposition can be deemed universal at all, it is only insofar as one presumes the existence of the other who may falsify it at present as well as in the future. To Popper, however, Kant appears to have presented a rather different, arguably even opposite, approach, as if universality could be guaranteed by a priori rule. But, one has to be extremely cautious with respect to Kant's positionality here, for, as we have seen, it was only after having confronted the problematic of the judgment of taste, that is, the universality in plural language games, that Kant wrote Critique of Pure Reason. Critique of Pure Reason begins by describing a single subjectivity, to be sure. This does not mean, however, that Kant neglected the existence of the multitude of other subjects. Rather, he did not even dream that universality could be attained by an agreement among plural subjectivities, that is, by intersubjectivity. For Kant, who was also a scientist, it was self-evident that an a priori synthetic judgment is not easily attained, and a fortiori not during his lifetime, when heterogeneous hypotheses were very much in conflict in the natural sciences and not merely on der Kampfplatz der Metaphysik. An agreement with others, no matter how many, and including a falsification that is based upon prior agreement, hardly guarantees universality. An agreement is customarily made within the realm of common sense, just to reinforce it. If universality at all exists, therefore, it must be something that goes beyond plural common senses. It is small surprise, then, that Popper's position came to be criticized within the philosophy of science. As Thomas Kuhn argued, there is a possibility that even a proposition posed in a falsifiable way is not always falsified. Instead, the institution of proof itself is determined by the paradigm. 19 Furthermore, as with Paul Feyerabend, the truth value of scientific cognition tout court is determined by discursive hegemony. 20 And so Popper eventually shifted his position to think of the development of science more in the manner of evolutionary theory, that is, that stronger theories survive. 21 Was the Kantian critique buried by these later deployments? I think not. First, Kuhn's paradigm closely corresponds to Kant's common sense. Second, what Kuhn spoke of in reference to his paradigm shift were only those geniuses, Copernicus, Newton, and Einstein, not unlike the geniuses who appear already in Kant's third critique. Perhaps Kuhn never dreamt of such a coincidence because of the complications. After all, Kant had limited his application of the concepts genius and common sense to the domain of fine art. And the sharp distinction between natural and cultural sciences made by the Neo-Kantians, Heinrich Rickert, among others, became very influential. Meanwhile, the concept paradigm is widely accepted against Kuhn's own design precisely because it addressed a problematic wider than that of natural science, which is to say that it has the impetus of criticism, or even literary criticism. Seen from this standpoint, it might be that contemporary philosophers of science have drawn close to the ground Kant cultivated in Critique of Judgment. But again it must be noted that Kant had already been aware of the problematic inherent in the arena of journalistic criticism when he began writing Critique of Pure Reason. In this first critique, the other, or the other subject, is ostensibly absent. The book persists in pursuing the introspective mode of inquiry. Those who criticize Kant unexceptionably question if introspective inquiry, that is, the monologue, is by itself sufficient to scrutinize the foundation of science. It is true that Kant did not seek to introduce the agreement of others, because the agreement itself would not guarantee a universal proposition. Instead, in the concept of the thing in itself, he implied the future others who could falsify. But this is not to say that our thought could never be universal because of future others. On the contrary, the question of universality could not be posed without taking the others into consideration. In the history of philosophy, Kant was the first to have introduced the problematic of the other in this succinct manner. 1.3 Parallax and the thing in itself philosophy begins with introspection. Nonetheless, the kind of introspection that Kant performed in Critique of Pure Reason is quite unique. It is a criticism of introspection. Thinking of this aspect of the Kantian introspection, one ought not ignore his rather strange text Dreams of a Visionary explained by Dreams of Metaphysics. Kant wrote this essay in 1766 for a journal in the playful style of 18th-century essayists. It was inspired by the famous earthquake that struck Lisbon on November 1, 1755, All Saints' Day, the very moment the faithful were at prayer in church. No wonder the event raised such skepticism about the grace of God. The Lisbon earthquake shook all Europe at its root, the general populace and intellectuals alike. It rent a deep crack between sensibility and understanding, as it were, which, right up to Leibniz, had maintained a relationship of remarkably seamless continuity. The Kantian critique cannot be separated from this profound and multi-layered crisis. Several years later, Voltaire wrote Candide, deriding Leibnizian predestined harmony, and Rousseau insisted that the earthquake was punishment for human societies having lost touch with nature. 22 By distinct contrast, Kant, who wrote as many as 3 analyses of the problem, stressed that the earthquake of 1755 had no religious meaning whatsoever, attributable as it was to natural causes alone. He also advanced scientific hypotheses about the cause of the quake, as well as possible countermeasures to avert future occurrences. It is noteworthy that while even empiricists could not help searching for meanings to attribute to the event, Kant did no such thing. But his radical materialism coexisted with the opposite and opposing radicalism that he simultaneously embraced, that is, his concern with metaphysics. That is to say that he was fascinated by the intellect of the visionary Swedenborg, who was said to have predicted the earthquake. Kant not only conducted an inquiry into Swedenborg's purportedly miraculous power, but also wrote a letter in the hope of meeting him. 23 Even with his interest in visionary phenomena, however, Kant persisted in his belief in natural causes. The former he considered to be daydreams, or a sort of brain disorder. He maintained that although a vision is in actuality just a thought in the mind, it appears to have come from the outside, by way of the senses. 24 At the same time, however, he could not deny Swedenborg's intellect. While, in many cases, the claim to perceive the suprasensible through the senses is delusional, there are a very few whose claims of possessing such power might in some sense be verifiable. Swedenborg was this exception. A first-class scientist, he was by no means demented. And, here there was credible evidence of his psychic power. Kant had to acknowledge this, but at the same time he had also to negate it. Though he called it a psychosis, he could not help taking the dreams of a visionary seriously. And yet he problematized his own seriousness. Therefore, by no means do I blame my readers, if they, instead of acknowledging the visionary as a half-citizen of the other world, are quick to write him off as a hospital candidate and thereby shirk from all further inquiry. 25 But this caveat would be less interesting, were it restricted merely to the visionary's dreams. Kant stresses that the same is true of metaphysicists and metaphysics, since they treat thought not deriving from experience as substantial. In this sense, his essay could be read as Dreams of Metaphysics explained by Dreams of a Visionary. He asks, what kind of folly exists which cannot be brought to the mood of the bottomless world wisdom, philosophy? Whereupon he continues, therefore, by no means do I blame my readers. In other words, The dreams of metaphysicists are also first-class folly, and evidence of a psychosis. There is no major difference between being obsessed with dreams of metaphysics and with the dreams of a visionary. At this moment of his life, Kant admitted that being obsessed with metaphysics was sheer madness, and yet philosophers could not help but be mad in this sense. Thus his essay is really speaking of a metaphysician in the guise of speaking of a visionary, and the metaphysician in this case was Kant himself, before he encountered Hume, that is. A decade and a half later, Kant opened the 1781 preface to Critique of Pure Reason, with the assertion that, in accordance with the fashion of the age, the Queen, read metaphysics proves despised on all sides. 26 Nonetheless, he added, it is pointless to affect indifference with respect to such inquiries, to whose object human nature cannot be indifferent. Moreover, however much they may think to make themselves unrecognizable by exchanging the language of the schools for a popular style, these so-called indifferentists, to the extent that they think anything at all, always unavoidably fall back into metaphysical assertions, which they yet professed so much to despise. 27 But this is precisely Kant's own split, or rather the one he had faced in Dreams of a Visionary, where he wrote in a completely self-contradictory, indeed, antinomic, manner. He both affirmed Swedenborg and metaphysics, and scorned this very affirmation. In Critique of Pure Reason, this conflict takes the form of denying reason's expansion of knowledge beyond its limit, even while acknowledging reason's drive to do precisely this. In the first critique, the satiric self-criticism of Dreams of a Visionary thus turns into a critique of reason by reason. Which is to say that, instead of treating this merely as his personal problem, Kant turns, by a process that a Freudian or Lacanian might well call transference, to treat it as a problem given to reason by the nature of reason itself. 28 This, precisely, is the crux of the transcendental critique, or one important aspect of what I am calling transcritique. In any case, the transposition from Dreams of a Visionary to Critique of Pure Reason is decisive. Yet, in order to read the latter, one must refer to the former. For it is there that Kant's idiosyncratic manner of reflection is explicit. 29 Formerly, Kant wrote in Dreams of a Visionary, I viewed human common sense only from the standpoint of my own. Now I put myself into the position of another's reason outside of myself, and observe my judgments, together with their most secret causes, from the point of view of others. It is true that the comparison of both observations results in pronounced parallax, but it is the only means of preventing the optical delusion, and of putting the concept of the power of knowledge in human nature into its true place. 30 Here Kant is not expressing the commonplace, that not only must one see things from one's own point of view, but also, simultaneously, from the point of view of others. If this is what he meant, it would be run-of-the-mill. The history of philosophy is filled with reflections on seeing oneself as others would see. In Kant this point of view of others would manifest itself only by way of the pronounced parallax. To understand this properly, it is necessary to exemplify a technology that did not exist in Kant's time. Reflection is often spoken of by way of the metaphor of seeing one's image in the mirror. The mirror image is identified with the image seen by the other. But in today's context, photography must also be taken into consideration. Let us compare them. At the time photography was invented, those who saw their faces in pictures could not help but feel a certain hideousness, just like hearing a tape recording of one's own voice for the first time. While it had been possible to see one's own image, whether by reflection in a mirror, water, or in a painted portrait, these methods were too subjective. Although the mirror image can be identified with the image seen by the other, there is still a certain complicity with regard to one's own viewpoint. After all, we can see our own image in the mirror any way we like. And the mirror image is not fully fixed, not to mention the fact that it is left right inverted or inside out. A painted portrait is a depiction by the other, but any hideousness in seeing the image can be ascribed to the subjectivity, read malice, of the other. By contrast, photography sustains a different, much more severe, objectivity. Even though there is always a photographer, his or her subjectivity is less influential than the painter's, for there is an ineradicable, mechanical distance in the photographic image. Strange as it may be, we cannot see our faces, read the thing in itself, except as an image reflected in the mirror, read phenomenon. And only thanks to the advent of photography, did we learn that fact. But again, photography is also an image, and, of course, people eventually get used to the mechanical image, so much so that they eventually come to feel that the image is themselves. But the crux here is the pronounced parallax, that which people presumably experience when they first see their photographic image. The effect of parallax is evident also in Derrida's statement that consciousness is equivalent to hearing oneself speak, Schentender parlor. 31. In regard to this claim, Hegel would say that it is the speaking that objectifies, or externalizes, enthäusert the self. But this objectified voice, or utterance, Äußerung in the Hegelian sense is not objective at all, it is merely my view. To be objective, there must be the displacement or derangement one experiences when one first hears one's own recorded voice. The hideousness or uncanniness one experiences is due to the viewpoint of others that intervenes therein. When I first see my face and hear my voice from the other's viewpoint, I think it is not my face nor my voice. In Freudian terms, this would be the resistance of the analysis and. Eventually, one comes to terms with the visual and audible images. One has to get used to them. But in philosophical reflection, this is not the case. The philosophy that begins with introspection mirror remains snared within the specular abyss of introspection. No matter how it seeks to introduce the other's stance, this situation never alters. It is said that philosophy began with Socrates' dialogues. But the dialogue itself is trapped within the mirror. Many have criticized Kant for having remained in a subjectivist self-scrutiny, and suggest that he sought an escape in Critique of Judgment when he introduced plural subjects. But the truly revolutionary event in philosophy had already occurred in Critique of Pure Reason, where Kant attempted to implode the complicity inherent in introspection precisely by confining himself to the introspective framework. Here one can observe the attempt to introduce an objectivity, qua otherness, that is totally alien to the conventional space of introspection mirror. Most straightforwardly said, what is at stake in Dreams of a Visionary is the critical position that Kant himself was in at that time, pursuing rationalist philosophy on the line of Leibniz Wolff. There was no other choice but to accept Hume's empiricist skepticism, yet he was not at all satisfied by either. For about 10 years after that, up until Critique of Pure Reason, he confined himself in silence. The stance that he called transcendental came into existence sometime during this period. Kant's approach in Critique of Pure Reason is different not only from subjective introspection, but also from objective scrutiny. Though it is a self-scrutiny through and through, the transcendental reflection inscribes others' viewpoint. Said inversely, though it is impersonal through and through, the transcendental reflection is still self-scrutiny. One tends to speak of the transcendental stance as a mere method, and worse still, one speaks of the structure of faculties Kant discovered as a given. The transcendental stance, however, could not have appeared if not for the pronounced parallax. Critique of Pure Reason is not written in the mode of self-criticism as is Dreams of a Visionary, but the pronounced parallax is present, functioning therein. It came to take the form of antinomy, the device to reveal both thesis and antithesis as optical illusions. After the publication of Critique of Pure Reason, Kant expressed his realization that the order of his reasoning would have been better if he had dealt with a distinction between phenomenon and the thing in itself after the antinomy of pure reason, in the section Transcendental Dialectic. 32 in fact, it is true that, because Kant began with the distinction between phenomenon and the thing in itself, many readers' understanding of Kant's total design, his architectonic retrogresses to the conventional duality of phenomenon and essence or surface and depth. This is the impression given to both those readers who deny and those who affirm the concept of the thing in itself. Those who reject it as mystical understand it only within the dichotomy, and even those who retain it, like Heidegger, interpret it only in the sense of the ontological depth or abyss, Abgrund. In truth, however, there are no mystical implications in the properly Kantian thing in itself. 33 It is something like one's own face in the sense that it undoubtedly exists but cannot be seen except as an image, read phenomenon. What is crucial here is henceforth the antinomy as a pronounced parallax, the sole thing that reveals what is more than an image, phenomenon. In fact, Kant poses antinomy not only in the section on the transcendental dialectic but almost everywhere. For instance, as one of the crucial examples, he draws out transcendental subjectivity X from the antinomy between the Cartesian thesis, there is an identical ego, and the Humean antithesis, there is no identical ego. It is generally understood that in Critique of Pure Reason, Kant considers the thing in itself as that which stimulates sensibility and gives it content, while in Critique of Practical Reason, transcendental subjectivity itself is deemed the thing in itself. This apparent inconsistency has caused much confusion. And, concomitant with this, there is the common interpretation that the first critique deals with the theoretical domain while the second deals with the practical. But this division is not accurate. Hannah Arendt refuted this idea, arguing that the counter-concept to the theoretical is not the practical, but the speculative. As I have clarified with respect to the third conflict of transcendental ideas, the theoretical stance that pursues laws of nature and the practical stance that pursues freedom can coexist, if the operation of bracketing one or the other is necessitated. In point of fact, even scientific theory can be in no other way than practical, because it would not even exist were it not for the regulative idea, the assumption that nature be elucidated. Kant himself addressed the issue of the doctrinal faith, or beliefs, der Doktrinale Glaube that accompanies theoretical judgments, theoretische Urteil as follows, Hus there is in merely theoretical judgments an analogous of practical judgments, where taking them to be true is aptly described by the word belief, and which weaken all doctrinal beliefs, der Doktrinale Glaube. If it were possible to settle by any sort of experience whether they are inhabitants of at least some of the planets that we see, I might well bet everything that I have on it. Hence I say that it is not merely an opinion but a strong belief, on the correctness of which I would wager many advantages in life, that there are also inhabitants of other worlds. 34 The connotation here is that scientific cognition, or synthetic judgment, is not speculation, and yet it inexorably involves a certain spec or bet, though one might also add that it is also a kind of spes, expectation or hope, insofar as it is related to faith. For this reason, scientific cognition can be expansive. However, just as it is misleading to definitively divide the theoretical and the practical, the thing in itself can also not be divided into the thing and the other ego, or the other subject. It is not the thing that negates, falsifies, a scientific hypothesis. It is not the thing but the future others who speak. However, while it is the other who can negate our cognition, qua phenomenon, this negation has to be accompanied by the other's sense datum, qua the thing. What is crucial here is the otherness, be it of the thing or of the other person. But this otherness is nothing mystical. What Kant implied by the thing in itself was the alterity of the other that we can never take for granted and internalize just on our whim or at our convenience. Nor is the point merely that Kant deplored the fact that we are able to know only phenomena and not substance. Rather, the Kantian point is that the universality of phenomena, qua synthetic judgment, is taken into consideration only insofar as we wholeheartedly posit the alterity or otherness of the other. Kant did consider the attitude that anticipates what the alterity would be as speculative. On the other hand, however, he also held that even though this attitude, again spes, attains only illusion, shine, it is a sine qua non, vis-à-vis the transcendental illusion. In fact, the regulative idea, that we be able to recognize nature, functions heuristically. The founder of cybernetics, Norbert Wiener, who was involved in the Manhattan Project, said that what was treated in the counterintelligence community as the real secret was not the manual for making the atom bomb. It was the fact that it had already been made. When both Germany and Japan were developing the idea of making the bomb, they would have succeeded in its production had they discovered that it was possible. Solving traditional chess problems is far easier than playing a real game of chess because the faith that the king can be checkmated is the most helpful clue to the problem's solution. The notion that the natural world comprises mathematical structure is also an example of theoretical faith. For the same reason, natural science came into existence only in the modern West thanks to the theoretical faith it had nurtured. It has also been said that Kant rejected metaphysics theology in Critique of Pure Reason but recuperated it in Critique of Practical Reason. In reality, he rebuffed it in the latter too, and in the former he made the point clear that all theories, if they are to be synthetic and expansive, cannot do away with a certain faith. What he sought in the second critique were the conditions prerequisite to establishing a universal law of ethics as opposed to a general moral order based on empirical data. By taking this approach, Kant rejected the truth claim of religion, but accepted it as a regulative idea. To be sure, one who chose to live strictly according to the universal law of ethics would doubtless lead a tragic life in reality. If not for eternal life and God's final judgment, such a life would inexorably culminate in absurdity. It follows that Kant had to accept faith as a regulative idea at the same time as he rejected any attempt to prove it theoretically, that is, he rejected this particular aspect of metaphysics. Necessarily misled by the categorical distinctions among the theoretical, the practical, and the aesthetic, one should not overlook the problematics Kant pursued consistently on other, different levels. What is most important is that, in seeking universality, Kant had to introduce the other, and that this other is not one who can be identified with the self in any sense of intersubjectivity or common sense. This is not some transcendent other, divine or God, but a transcendental other. Nor is this other one who introduces relativism into our thinking, but rather the one who makes us face the problem of universality. The rigorous consistency of the Kantian critique, which informs all his work, derives directly from this radical point of departure, the problematic of universality in the judgment of taste, which is also to say, criticism in a journalistic sense. This page intentionally left blank to the problematic of synthetic judgment